hello to the group at Hamilton, the Cathedral, to the group in New Plymouth, to Raglan, to Te Kuiti, to Kawhia, to Hawera and to Te Aroha. It's great to have you on board too, joining us. Thank you. Great. Well, good evening, everybody. Welcome to LiFT session 5. Can you believe it? We're over a month in. And I was speaking to the vicar of Whangamata today, Peter Minson, and he was saying that he'd heard that last week we'd done the whole Old Testament, and he was really impressed that last week we managed to cover the entire Old Testament. I said to him that the Old Testament session was a little bit like the TARDIS, in the sense that the session looks quite small, but when you go inside, you can cover a lot of ground. So this week we're dialing back a little bit, and that we're starting to look at the New Testament. And tonight we're going to be looking particularly at the Gospels and a little bit at the book of Acts. But before we get into that, let's do what we usually do, and that is to check back on the material last week and what stood out for us during the week. Hope your journaling is going well, and so just spend a few minutes together thinking about what in last week's material on the Old Testament stood out for you, and what have you been thinking about during the week. So if you have a go at that, I'll check back with you again shortly. Welcome back, everybody. We're going to just do a sort of quick overview intro into the New Testament as a whole, just to sort of orient ourselves to it. I mean, my guess is that you're probably quite familiar with the New Testament, but there may be parts of it that you're not. For example, I think even I would struggle if you said to me, can you list all the books in the New Testament in their correct order? I'm familiar with the New Testament, but there are certainly parts of it that I probably couldn't name in the order. But anyway, let's make a start. So basically the New Testament falls into 4 sections. Okay, and these kind of sections are all, roughly speaking, types of text. Okay, so types of books. So we start with the Gospels, the 4 Gospels, which tell us about the life of Jesus. The next section is actually just one book, and that is Acts, the Acts of the Apostles, and that tells us about the life of the early church. Then we get a whole series of letters, or sometimes they're called epistles, running from Romans through to Jude. And the only one in that group that there's a bit of a question mark over is the book of Hebrews, because strictly speaking, that's not a letter. It's often described as a letter, but it's probably more accurate to describe Hebrews as some kind of sermon or an extended reflection. So it's not, strictly speaking, a letter, but you'll often see it referred to as a letter. And then finally, when we get right to the end of the New Testament, again, just with one book, we have the book of Revelation. And we will have a whole session, actually, I think, focusing on Revelation, because it's such an interesting and slightly strange text that I figured that we probably needed to spend a bit of time actually delving into it. And that's a whole type of material that's known as apocalyptic literature. So all that word means is that it has to do with things that are revealed at the end of time. That's what the Greek word apocalypsis means. It means revelation. That's why we call the book of Revelation the book of Revelation. All of the books in the New Testament are written in Greek. They're written in a type of Greek that's known as Koine Greek, so Koine, Koine Greek, and that translates as common Greek. So if you meet somebody who's well versed in Greek classical literature, who's a classical scholar, they will probably look very disdainfully at you talking with enthusiasm about the Greek of the New Testament, because it's considered to be not particularly pleasant or attractive. There are some parts in the New Testament that are very poetic, but by and large the type of Greek you get in the New Testament is kind of street. It's street language, which I think is quite interesting. It's hip, I think might be the word, or hipster, alternatively. But anyway, most of the New Testament is taken up with letters. Okay, so 21 out of the 27 books are letters, and again, I did mention a minute ago about Hebrews, probably not being a letter, but anyway, it's kind of in the mix. The other books are biographies or gospels, and the really important thing about gospel is that it's basically an entirely new form of literature. So classical literature could be quite neatly categorised, you might say, but the Gospels was something altogether different. They're kind of biographies, and you do get examples of classical literature that are very clearly biographies. So the Gospels are a little bit like that, but they're also doing something very new and very different. So scholars describe it as being an entirely new form or genre of writing, which I think is quite interesting. So the Gospels in and of themselves are groundbreaking documents. They're very new. There's a history book, which is the Acts of the Apostles, telling us about the history of the early church. Though, as we'll see, we need to think quite carefully about what we mean by that word history. It's not necessarily history as we might describe it today in the 21st century, but it is possible to describe it in its context as an historical text. It's telling us, it's narrating us the story of the early church. And then, as I said, a book of apocalyptic prophecy, which is the book of Revelation. So, although the New Testament's written in Greek, Jesus himself would have spoken Aramaic mostly, which is a form of Hebrew, it's a dialect of Hebrew. And the New Testament does preserve some Aramaic phrases, which you might be familiar with. Talitha Kumi in Mark chapter 5, which means, little girl, get up. The rather tongue-twisting Epaphatha, try and say that very quickly, in Mark chapter 7, open up. Abba is an Aramaic word meaning father, though it's quite an intimate word for father. And then, of course, Jesus' cry on the cross, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, my God, why have you forsaken me? So it's interesting that the New Testament does still preserve some of the original dialect that Jesus would have spoken, Aramaic. Probably the Gospels were written in Greek because they would reach a wider audience. Okay, so if the Gospels had been written in Aramaic, they may not have reached a wide audience. Greek was a pretty common language in the Roman Empire, so if you're going to write it in a language that can be widely distributed and understood, then Greek is a good way to go. Now, when you open your New Testament, the first thing you'll see are the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. But just because they appear first in the New Testament doesn't mean to say that they are the earliest documents that we have in the New Testament. And it's not even the case, as we'll see, that Matthew is the first Gospel. So the order of the New Testament is probably something to do with, well, the Gospels are important, so we'll put them in first. But actually our earliest documents in the New Testament are the Pauline letters. And it's a bit of a toss-up between Galatians and 1 Thessalonians as to which is the absolute earliest Pauline letter. So that's important to note. The Gospel of Mark, as we'll see shortly, is probably the earliest Gospel, written somewhere in the 60s, in the first century. The letters are much earlier than that, so in the 40s, so not long after Jesus' death and resurrection. And really, I suppose one reason why the Gospels come a bit later is because they're originally circulating as oral traditions. Okay, so people are telling stories of Jesus to groups like yourselves sitting round, that there's no need to have them written down in documents because we're dealing with an oral culture where people tell stories and we use our ears to listen and absorb. It's only, I guess, when the original apostles begin to die, basically, that somebody thinks, oh, we better kind of make a note of some of these things. So you get Mark, for example, who's probably the earliest gospel. It's thought that Mark is writing from eyewitness accounts from Peter. So Mark teams up with Peter and makes a note of some of the stories that Peter tells about his life and experience of Jesus. So that's quite interesting as well, because it gives us a very close link to the original life, I guess, of the apostles and of Jesus. So the Gospels are really closely linked in with Jesus' life, even if they are a little bit later. We have 4 Gospels, okay, and one thing that you'll notice when you particularly look at Mark, Matthew and Luke is that those 3 Gospels have a lot of material in common. And that's because those 3 Gospels do have a direct relationship. And for that reason, they're sometimes known as Synoptic Gospels. So if you ever hear anybody talk about the Synoptics, they are referring to Matthew, Mark and Luke, and that word synoptic just simply means seen with one gaze. Okay? Because they have a literary relationship with one another, which we'll say a little bit about, but not too much, because believe me, scholars have tried to deal with something called the Synoptic Problem, and it gets very mathematical and very technical. So I will spare you the joy of that. If you're interested in that, I can certainly recommend some readings, but just take my word for it that those 3 Gospels have a literary relationship, and that's important. John does have a relationship with the 3 Gospels, but John's Gospel is often seen as kind of a bit different. We shouldn't put John too far away from the other 3 Gospels, but John is clearly doing something a little bit different with his material. Some of the chronology, so the order of events of Jesus' life in John are different. So you'll notice that the cleansing of the temple happens right at the start of Jesus' ministry in John's Gospel. In the Synoptics, of course, it's one of the things that happens very close to the journey through Holy Week. And people often think of John as being a deeper, more theological gospel. John, for example, only has less miracles than the Synoptic Gospels. So there are a number of differences there. Still a relationship, but some differences. Now, the book of Acts was probably written by the same person that wrote the Gospel of Luke. If you look at the start of Acts, it says, in my first book, O Theophilus, I did this, and now I'm going to carry on. So people often refer to Luke Acts kind of in one breath. Those 2 texts are related. Luke kind of takes the story up to Jerusalem, and then Acts takes the story from Jerusalem global, if you see what I mean. So those 2 books are related, which is worth knowing about. Now, when we get to the letters, there are 8 letters of Paul that we think are definitely written by Paul. Romans, 1 and 2 Corinthians, 1 and 2 Thessalonians, Galatians, Philippians and Philemon, which is a really, really, really short letter, just a number of verses. When we get to Colossians and Ephesians, there is some questioning about the authorship of those letters. So I don't think you should be too concerned about that, but rather just know that there are some question marks, over those letters. And the reason why some people have raised question marks over those letters have quite a lot to do with the language in the letters. So if you analyse closely the Greek, Paul's style, effectively, things seem to be a little bit different in Colossians and Ephesians, so we're not quite sure what's going on there. But again, just to reassure you, don't be too alarmed. Most people refer to those letters still as being Pauline. Whether Paul wrote them or not, we can't be 100% sure, but they're definitely written by somebody who was close to Paul or somebody in Paul's school of thought. But, as with so much, there's a scholarly debate about that. So, scholars like to have debates, and that's one of the debates that they have. Indeed, there was in the ancient world a real tradition of, and here's your word for the night, pseudepigraphy. Okay, that word there. Some letters use Paul in a pseudepigraphic way. Okay, so if you break that word down, you might know what a pseudonym is. A pseudepigraphic text is basically like me saying, say I'm familiar with Canon Brian Bang's extensive writings on a particular matter, and I decide that I think they're so good that we need to continue that sort of style of expertise and excellence. So I decide to write a text as if I were Canon Brian Bang. And I still say that the text is written by Canon Brian Bang, but in fact it wasn't. I wrote it. But I'm paying him the highest honour by crafting a text in his name. Okay, so there are some letters in the New Testament, 1 and 2 Timothy and Titus, that are most certainly not written by Paul, but rather written by somebody who's claiming Paul wrote them. Now, in the modern world, that would be seen as a bit dodgy. Plagiarism is the word that often comes to mind, but in the ancient world, that was a pretty standard practice, and it was completely okay. What is the reason that we think Paul definitely didn't write those letters? Well, there's two reasons, I suppose. One is some of the way in which the early church is described and structured in those letters seems to be quite late. It doesn't seem to reflect the early period of the early church that Paul was more cognizant of. And secondly, the Greek of those letters is very different from the sort of Greek, the way of writing that Paul himself wrote. So those are two reasons. But again, we shouldn't be too concerned about that, because the fact is they're written within the Pauline school of thought, and they still form part of our New Testament. And the remaining letters in the New Testament are James, Jude, 1 and 2 Peter, and 1, 2 and 3 John. Okay, and then last but not least, the book of Revelation, which we will get to not quite at the end of block 1, but almost at the end of block 1. So this evening we're going to be spending all our time really looking at particularly at the 4 Gospels, and just a little bit at the book of Acts when we're thinking about Luke. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to run through each Gospel, and then we're going to pause at the end of each Gospel for you to have some conversation in your groups about the points to ponder, because I'm aware there's quite a lot of material tonight to get through, and I don't want to overload you. But so we'll see how we go. All right, so Mark, let's start with Mark. Now, last week I suggested that if you had an opportunity to read a Gospel, to look at a Gospel, you might want to look at Mark. And hopefully some of you have been able to do that. One of the things that I think always strikes me about Mark is that it does seem to be a Gospel in a hurry. It's very pacey. Mark is the shortest Gospel, and it's probably the earliest Gospel, written somewhere in the 60s of the 1st century, so after the birth, death, resurrection of Jesus. When you read Mark, if you read Mark in one setting, from start to the end, you really get a sense that the narrative's quite breathless, and it seems to slow down the closer we get to the cross. And that's quite intentional, actually, I think, in the way Mark crafts his narrative. Mark also, throughout his narrative, slows down to the point of isolating Jesus as a character until Jesus is completely alone on the cross. So it's quite cleverly crafted, really, both to kind of enable us to be swept up in the drama of the Gospel, but then slowing down so that there's a real focus on the person of Jesus, which, after all, is what the Gospel is all about. Mark's favourite word is the word for immediately, which in Greek is euthus. Quite often in Mark you get the phrase kai euthus, and immediately. And the more you read Mark, you begin to notice this. You think, oh, there he is again. And immediately has this impact on people. So if you read Mark, watch out for the way that word is used. One of the other interesting things about Mark is the very start of the Gospel. So if you open your version of Mark's Gospel you will probably see written the beginning of the good news. Okay? So if you see that, that actually tells us what gospel is. It's good news. The Greek word is euangelion. Okay, so break that down to EU, which means good, and angelion, angelos, angel, good message, basically. But in the Greek in Mark, there is unusually no word for the at the start of the gospel. It seems that Mark is, well, his Greek is maybe not great, but in any case, he seems in such a rush to kind of get on with the story that we just simply get the word beginning. Okay, there's no word for the there, and that's an important point, because it's almost like Mark is making an announcement, which in the context in which Mark is writing is really significant, because people would be used to getting announcements from Rome, the headline, a bold announcement of some brand new whatever policy or chariot tax or something like that, I don't know, but it's really clear that Mark is making almost like an empire-like announcement. This is something that is life-changing. This is something that we need to sit up and take notice of. It's that important. So that's quite helpful, I think, in helping us to understand why the Gospels are so important. Sometimes we can be a bit complacent about them, I think, but really they are of such significance that they are about a life-changing and a world-changing event. Now, when we look at Mark, there are a couple of ways to summarise what happens in Mark, which you've got here in the box-marked outline. The first consists of 5 points that basically goes like this. So Jesus appears, preaching God's rule. Remember that Mark doesn't have any nativity narrative, so don't try and do Mark for your Christmas nativity play this year, because not going to be very helpful. We're straight into the action of John the Baptist, kind of bursting on the scene. So Jesus appears, preaching God's rule. Then Jesus ministers in Galilee. Then there's a focus on Jesus and the disciples' mission. Then there's some healing stories and some teaching stories. And then the last part of Mark's Gospel, which actually proportionately takes up quite a lot of the Gospel, is all about Jesus in Jerusalem and the journey towards the cross and beyond the cross. But of course, the beyond the cross bit is quite brief, and that's the other slight puzzle about Mark's Gospel, that the original ending is chapter 16, verse 8. The women at the tomb experience the resurrection, but they say nothing to anyone because they're afraid. That's it. So naturally people are thinking, well, that's not really a satisfying way to end the gospel. I mean, you can't imagine a Hollywood film just kind of ending like that. People would want their money back. So not surprisingly, people decided to add some endings. So you do have in your New Testament and Mark's Gospel some 2 endings, a shorter ending and a longer ending. But these are not original to the Gospel. Okay? The earliest manuscripts end quite clearly at chapter 16, verse 8. Now the question is, well, why? Well, one answer is that a theologically keen bunny rabbit nibbled the manuscript at the essential point. But more plausibly is the suggestion that Mark actually does mean to end his gospel there. Not so much with a full stop, but with a ... But that's something that you need to ponder. What does that short and abrupt ending mean? Maybe it means that we ourselves are meant to pick up the story and continue it. Maybe it means that we ourselves are meant to go back to the start of Mark's Gospel and reread the whole Gospel, this time in the light of the resurrection, and see what difference that makes. So it's almost like we have that good news. Well, what does it then mean to read through the whole of the Gospel knowing that at the end the resurrection will happen? So there's a number of theories out there, but for now, worth noting that Mark's Gospel starts suddenly and ends abruptly. Starts suddenly and ends abruptly. Another briefer summary is simply this, in 2 parts, chapter 1 through to the middle of chapter 8. Who is this man? Who is Jesus? And then the second part, why? Why will Jesus die? And you'll note that what happens at that pivotal point is it's the confession of Peter. So at that point, the narrative seems to switch gear somewhat. But that's a useful way of encapsulating the whole gospel. Who is Jesus? Why must he die? There are some key themes in Mark's gospel, which we'll summarise here. First is secrecy. Now, this is an interesting one. If you read Mark's Gospel, you'll notice that quite a lot of the time something happens and Jesus tells people to, shh, don't say anything, which kind of seems counterintuitive, surely. And in fact, I guess people probably did. If somebody tells you, okay, what I'm about to tell you is a secret, okay, 9 times out of 10, at least in my experience, somebody then goes off and kind of says, you'll never guess what. This is meant to be a secret, but the rest is history. But anyway, it does seem that Mark kind of has this theme of secrecy running throughout his gospel, which is interesting. One of the reasons why there might be an emphasis on secrecy is a thinking that deep belief in Jesus needs to be founded on trust. And quite often in Mark's Gospel, you'll have a situation where there's not a relationship of trust in place in the wider sense of the community. Therefore, it's not quite the right time to be sharing the story. That's one possibility. But it is a thing that's particular to Mark. None of the other Gospels seem to have it. So Mark seems to have an emphasis on secrecy and possibly an emphasis on that you need to build trust in order to really accept and understand that good news message. Secondly, there's a big emphasis on trying to figure out who Jesus is, and that's quite important. And the way Mark answers this is that he gives Jesus different titles. Jesus is Son of God, he's Messiah, King and Son of David, and he's Son of Man. And the Son of Man is a really important title because it's actually a title that indicates Jesus' divinity. Now, I know that doesn't quite make sense because you kind of think Son of Man, well, that's a human thing. But if you look at the way Son of Man is used in the book of Daniel, for example, it's quite clearly a divine-like figure, somebody who represents the people of God and is presented to God to receive power, honour and authority. So, Son of Man is an important title for Mark. And then also, Jesus fulfills the Old Testament image of the servant of God. Okay, so titles for Jesus are a really important part of Mark trying to describe who Jesus is. Another theme is throughout the whole Gospel there's a sense that it's all about the passion, it's all about the death and resurrection. Sometimes referred to as a lifelong passion. I think Archbishop Rowan Williams in his little book on Mark's Gospel talks about Mark being a lifelong passion as a way of indicating to us in our journey of discipleship that we too are walking with Christ to the cross and beyond that. Next, discipleship is a really important theme in Mark's Gospel, not surprisingly, because we need to figure out why it is we're following Jesus, who is Jesus, and why does following him make sense, why is it important. And you get a number of allusions to this, particularly in the way in which vocabulary is used, so vocabulary of calling and following, missioning and sending. There are some quite explicit instructions on discipleship, but crucially with Mark's Gospel, the disciples frequently get things spectacularly wrong. And we know that this is probably authentic because by the time we get to the other Gospels, there's a bit of airbrushing going on the other gospel writers are less keen to show the disciples warts and all, whereas Mark, no problem. The disciples frequently get things completely wrong. So that's another important thing to bear in mind. Mark has a number of what are called literary features. So one of my favourite is the Markan sandwich. So the next time you make a sandwich for your lunch, think about a Markan sandwich. And what this basically means is that Mark puts a story as the kind of meat or cheese in the centre, and then the bread wrapped around it is something else to help explain what that story's about. So one of the best known examples is the combination of Jesus's cursing of the fig tree and his demonstration in the temple. So look at the way in which those two stories interact with one another. So when Mark does this, readers should ask how Mark is using the interaction between the two stories. Do they help interpret each other? And there's a couple of other examples of Markan sandwiches there for you to have a look. And the question you need to be asking yourself is, what effect does the sandwiching have in these examples? And finally, as I've said already, beginnings and endings are really important in Mark. It starts abruptly and it ends abruptly. So that's quite an interesting thing to note. Okay, that's quite enough for me for just now. So if you take a few minutes in your groups to look at to either reflect on that, is there anything that surprised you in what I've said just now, or have a look maybe at one of the points to ponder at the bottom of page 9. Okay, so I'll be back with you in a few minutes. Let's plough on with a bit of a discussion on Matthew's Gospel. So one of the interesting things about Matthew's Gospel, it's later than Mark, and it contains a lot of teaching, a lot of blocks of teaching, but it's also very clearly written from a Jewish perspective. So Matthew is crafting his text. So just imagine Matthew sitting down with Mark as one of his main sources, but also with other material that he has access to. And the way in which he crafts all that material together, that he really wants to bring out the Jewishness of Jesus. And there are a number of ways in which Matthew shows his attachment to Judaism. So if you look at the Sermon on the Mount, begins with the Beatitudes, which is a sort of literary idea, blessed be, whatnot, is very frequently used in Judaism. For example, from the book of Sirach, blessed is anyone who has not sinned in speech, blessed is anyone whose conscience does not reproach him, etc. Blessed is anyone who rejects the advice of the wicked, in Psalm, and then quite a few other mentions of that type in the Psalms. So there's a lot of emphasis on blessing. Secondly, the fulfilment of the law is really important to Matthew. Quite often you'll get something happen and this was to fulfill, you will see, and then you get an Old Testament passage of some description quoted. So that's quite an important way in which we can understand how Matthew is wanting to craft his text for a Jewish audience. And so the importance of fulfilment is really quite dominant, and there's all sorts of examples of that under point 3, the naming of Jesus, the returning of Jesus to Galilee, the purpose of Jesus' healing activity, the reason of Jesus' secrecy even the meaning of the death of Jesus. It's all done to fulfill what was foretold. So Matthew wants to craft his story to emphasise Jesus' Jewishness. But at the same time, you will notice in Matthew's Gospel there are different points where Matthew seems to be very critical of Judaism. So if you look at chapter 23, for example, where he denounces the scribes and the Pharisees. Okay, so you kind of think, well, if Matthew's trying to be emphasising the Jewishness of Jesus, why does he then condemn Judaism at the same time. So a couple of things there. One, it's really important to bear in mind that when we come to thinking about Judaism in the first century, the time of Jesus, we're not talking about a monolithic entity, okay? There were lots of different groups in Judaism. We know some of those groups from the New Testament, scribes, Pharisees, Sadducees, for example. But there was a lot of variety in Judaism in the first century. There were some things that Jews all agreed on, so they agreed in their belief of God. That's a good starting point. And they also agreed that the law was really important, but crucially, they liked to debate the meaning of the law. But within that, there were all sorts of groups. Okay? You even get the group by the Dead Sea. I've spoken in previous weeks about the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, they were quite an extreme group, that they basically thought everyone else is not good enough, so we're going to separate ourselves off and go into the wilderness and do our own thing. So Judaism in the first century is full of variety. So there's actually not really a problem with Matthew having a go at some groups within Judaism, because we all know from the variety of Christian denominations that sometimes Christians aren't particularly complementary to each other, although we do try to be. One of the most important scholarly works on Matthew was written by a New Zealand-born man, sadly no longer with us, called Graham Stanton, who taught at Cambridge University. And he wrote a book called A Gospel for a New People, which argued that Matthew's anti-Judaism represents, and he says, anger and frustration at the continued rejection of Christian claims. The anger may seem harsh by our standards, but by the standards of Matthew's Judaism, the statements are not harsh when you look at some of the statements made by the people by the Dead Sea, who were very condemning of others. However we seek to resolve this issue, it is more complex than might at first appear, and we should guard against oversimplification. I think that's a really important headline generally in life. Guard against oversimplification. Okay? We are dealing with a religious context that is very complex. Okay? If you grasp nothing else this evening, grasp something of the complexity of the first century context within which the Gospels were born and created. Now, Matthew structures his material really carefully. He starts chapter 1, verse 1, kind of like Genesis, I guess. He says the book of the Genesis, or the genealogy, and then he ends at the end with until the end of the age. So there's a kind of bookending way in which Matthew constructs his literature. So the story of Jesus is set within a wider narrative. Matthew's Greek's a little bit more polished than Mark, and he's structured his gospel quite carefully. There are 5 teaching blocks, each of which have a theme and a transitional phrase when Jesus had finished all these sayings, etc. Chapters 5 to 7 have a coherent shape, and there's also a whole chapter that has parables in it. Chapter 13, one of my favourite parts of that is right at the end of that chapter. You get Jesus saying to the disciples, "Have you understood all of these things?" And the disciples say, "Yes." But I kind of wonder what sort of yes that was. It was a kind of yes with a footnote of we might have to discuss this later, or yes, or we better say yes, otherwise we might get a whole other chapter on parables, and we really had quite enough, thank you very much. But anyway, whole of chapter 13 is on parables. So you get there in that text box, top of page 11, kind of an outline and a structure of the gospel. So take some time this week to look at that. Some of the literary features and the themes of Matthew. Well, Matthew's quite keen on twos, putting things together in twos, and there's a number of examples there. Jesus' disciples are portrayed in a much better light than they are in Mark. Jesus' opponents are they're definitely not portrayed in a very attractive way. Themes of forgiveness and judgment are quite important in Matthew, and you really get a focus in Matthew's gospel that the gospel is for the Jews, not really for the Gentiles, nor for the Samaritans. But we understand that by saying that, well, Matthew is writing for a Jewish audience, helping them to understand who Jesus is. Matthew's description of discipleship is quite interesting too. And one of the interesting things I think about it is that it necessitates putting faith into action. So authentic discipleship is about doing things, not just listening, but actually going out and doing things. Matthew's the only Synoptic Gospel writer to use the word church, which is in Greek ekklesia, which means called out, by the way. That's what the church means. It doesn't mean called in, called into your building. It means called out of your building into the community. And he uses it to directly describe the community of Jesus's followers. The kingdom of God is important in Matthew's gospel, although it's expressed as the kingdom of heaven. In Matthew, John the Baptist first announces the coming of the kingdom of heaven, and Jesus takes the theme up in his Sermon on the Mount, in parables and elsewhere. Okay, let's just take a few minutes to think about Matthew's gospel and what has struck you about it. I'll be back with you in 2 shakes of a duck's tail. Our espresso version of the Gospels. Let's have a look at Luke. Hopefully, by the way, in between now and next week, you'll have a chance to spend some time with this material and dwell with it a little bit than we have been able to tonight. But anyway, let's have a look at Luke. And as I said earlier, when you look at Luke, it's good to partner that with Acts because they're written by the same person. If you'll see from that outline at the bottom of page 13, Luke takes the story from Galilee to Jerusalem, and then Acts takes it from Jerusalem to Rome, which is, to all intents and purposes, the whole world. Who wrote Luke, Acts, and when? Now, interestingly, with Luke, he probably has the most polished Greek. There was a prize going for the best Greek award for the Gospel writers. Luke would probably win it. So that indicates that whoever wrote Luke was probably quite well educated. Interestingly, in Acts, there's this interesting, claim that the author makes to having travelled with the Apostle Paul. You'll notice certain sections of Acts shift from I, whatever, to we. You know, we did this. And that's quite interesting. Now, either the author is doing that himself or the author's using an account of somebody who was with Paul. We don't know for sure. But evidence dating from the end of the 2nd century identifies the author as Luke, who's mentioned in other places in the New Testament. Colossians suggests that Luke was a Gentile, and in verse 14 of chapter 4, Luke is called Luke, the beloved physician. But there's nothing in Luke Acts that suggests that the author had a specialised knowledge of medicine. But there is this tradition of Luke being a doctor. So that's quite interesting as well. Dating Luke, most scholars prefer sometime after 70, which, remember, the year 70 is important because that's when the temple was destroyed. Because there are 2 parts in Luke that seem to show some knowledge about the destruction of the temple. The whole of Luke Acts is generally dated to sometime between 80 and 100, the 1st century. The emphasis on Paul in Acts suggests that the 2-volume work may have been written for Gentile churches established by Paul. So I guess that's one of the most important thing about Luke. If we think of Matthew for a minute as being the gospel for the Jews, Luke is definitely the gospel for the Gentiles. Okay. Time and time again, you get in Luke an emphasis on salvation for people who are not Jewish, for Gentiles, and you get this sense of reversal. So the underdog always wins out. Luke is often used by those involved in social justice, for example, because it emphasises quite a lot that things will be reversed. If you look right at the start of Luke's Gospel, that's worth looking at the start of Luke, also the start of Acts, because this tells us more about the author and how he wrote the Gospel. And the author acknowledges that many people have tried to write orderly accounts. Now that's interesting, okay, because we've got 4 Gospels, but Luke seems to be suggesting that there's a whole bunch of other attempts floating around, which is quite interesting. And he also implies that people haven't been entirely successful. But Luke tells us that he's done it carefully and in order. My intention is that you should have a complete knowledge of the truth of the things which you have been taught. Now this was quite a standard way in ancient writing of saying, look, my version is the best version, the most reliable version. Top of page 15 there, you've got the start of Josephus, who was a first century Jewish writer who wrote an account of the Jewish war, the revolt against the Romans, which led to the destruction of the temple. If you compare those 2 prologues, you'll get a sense that Luke is doing something that's quite common in the ancient world, saying, you know, this is my account, I'm going to give it a go because other people haven't been able to do it very well, and my account's the best. So that's just quite an interesting point of view from the sort of the genre, what kind of material Luke is working with. Luke, like Mark and Matthew indeed, portray Jesus using titles. So Jesus is Son of God. Jesus fulfills Jewish hope. Remember, fulfillment's also an important theme in Matthew. Well, it is there in Luke. Jesus is Saviour and Lord. Luke alone calls Jesus Saviour. And then Jesus is himself cast in the role of one of the prophets of Israel. That's quite interesting as well, because that indicates that there are still Jewish elements, obviously, in the Gospel, because Jesus was Jewish, so you should expect that. But, like I said a moment ago, Luke stresses that there's salvation for non-Jews, there's salvation for the underdog, lots of emphasis on that. The Holy Spirit plays a really important role in both Luke and Acts. Discipleship's important in Luke's Gospel as well. A true disciple is characterised especially by humility, the right use of material possessions, and prayer. Luke adds to these passages 2 parables that emphasise the need to ask boldly and to persist in prayer. In Luke, Jesus prays at key points in his ministry. So prayer is a really important theme in Luke's Gospel. And the theme of the coming of the kingdom is also contained in Luke. So you'll get some themes there that are similar to Mark and Matthew. Okay, so you get a sense that they're all playing with the same kind of material, but Luke has his own particular emphasis on salvation for the Gentiles and salvation for the underdog. So there's something important in the gospel message that is for everyone, not just for the chosen people, and is for people who would not normally be considered part of the in crowd. Okay. I think that was probably the world's quickest whiz through Luke's Gospel. But we've got one more Gospel to go, which we'll get to in a moment. So just take a few moments to ponder the particularities of Luke, and I'll be back with you soon. Finally, we've got John's Gospel, which, as I said at the beginning, is often put in a little box over here with the other Gospels in relationship to one another. The title that I've got there at the top of page 17 is quite a good description, really, of an impression that you get looking at John's Gospel. It's a Gospel that's rich and deep. And we kind of get that impression right from the get-go. If you read the Johannine prologue, chapter 1, verses 1 to 18, you really have a sense that, this is quite a different sort of narrative. John is taking us right back to the start of the story, to the book of Genesis, actually, and playing with that theme of beginning. And although we don't have a nativity story again in John, we have a sort of mention of the incarnation. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And the Greek word at that point is probably better translated as the Word became flesh and tabernacled or pitched its tent in our midst. That's what the Greek is saying at that point. So you could, an option for your church nativity play this year could be an alternative, simply set up a tent in the centre of your church, and that is your nativity play. I wonder how many parishes throughout the diocese will give that a go. I think that might be a little bit unpopular. But hey, if you want to do an alternative one, set a tent up in your church. That's the incarnation. So the first half of John's Gospel is really focusing deeply on Jesus' identity. And then the second part of the Gospel, chapters 13 to 21, is all about the road to glory, basically. The road to the cross, but beyond to the resurrection and what happens after that. So that's quite a neat breaking down of the structure of John's Gospel. The language and the style, the setting and the date. John's Gospel is quite simple Greek, so it's not quite as poetic as Matthew or particularly Luke. And the style of it's quite varied. You get poetry in the prologue. Chapter 17 is basically a long prayer, and then a rather straightforward narrative in chapters 18 to 20. There aren't parable stories in John's Gospel, for example, a characteristic of the other Gospels. John calls the miracles signs, and there are less of them. So that's telling us that each one is pointing to something deeper about Jesus' identity. And there's a lot of contrasts in John's Gospel as well, contrasts such as light and darkness, which actually parallel quite closely to other Jewish sources, particularly the Dead Sea Scrolls. John's Gospel is usually dated late, so possibly the last of the Gospels, to the end of the 1st century or possibly the beginning of the 2nd century. John is keen to stress Jesus' messiahship, Jesus' Jewish Messiah. John is keen to stress that Jesus is divine. There's quite a lot of emphasis on Jesus being Son of God, more so than Matthew, Mark or Luke. There are discussions about the reasons for believing, so the signs are particularly relevant for this, and also the importance of witnesses. So if you look at chapter 20, verses 30 and 31, Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples. These are written that you may believe that Jesus, and so on. The miracle stories, as I said, are signs, and there are 7 of these, or possibly 8, if you count the resurrection. Jesus is divine and human. So John has a very strong portrayal of Jesus as divine. So much so that you could argue that the human part of Jesus in John is often downplayed. And actually this led to a 2nd century heresy, which asserted that Jesus was fully divine but only appeared to be human. And that heresy is known as Docetism. It's one of the great heresies of the early church. So while it's true that, for example, if you look at the portrayal of Jesus' death, Jesus does seem to be in control and doesn't seem to suffer as much as the other Gospels portray, we should remember the key phrase in the prologue, chapter 1, verse 14, where John says that the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. So always remember that phrase. And the Jesus of John gets tired, sheds tears, and is thirsty. So there's some very human elements to John's portrayal of Jesus, as well as an emphasis on Jesus' divinity. And the Holy Spirit, like the other Gospels, the Holy Spirit plays an important role in John's Gospel. Jesus is going away, he's enabled to return through the Holy Spirit. So after his death, the risen Jesus breathes on or in the disciples and says, receive the Holy Spirit. So if you're looking at John through the week, notice things like the miracle stories or the signs. What is it in these signs that we read and understand about who Jesus is. And the other thing that John does quite a lot is that he has the I am sayings. That's another literary feature of John's Gospel. And there are particular points in the Gospel where Jesus says, I am the bread of life. I am the way, the truth, the life, that kind of thing. The first I am saying actually, interestingly, comes in chapter 4 with Jesus' encounter with the Samaritan woman. It's often overlooked actually, but in that chapter Jesus says, I am the one speaking to you, which I think is quite good, that Jesus is the one who's in conversation with us, constantly revealing who he is, that we might more fully understand and continue that conversation with others. So if you've got time during the week, have a look at this material, look again at the Gospels, maybe have a look at a different Gospel if you looked at Mark as a preparation for tonight, maybe have a look at John or one of the other Gospels and notice the particular ways in which those Gospels emphasise elements of our faith and emphasise something about the person of Jesus. Next week we are going to be looking at the letters in the New Testament, and we're going to spend quite a lot of that time actually thinking about Paul and then looking particularly at Paul's first letter to the Corinthians. There's not time next week to look at all the letters, but there is time to spend with 1 Corinthians. So if you have an opportunity this week, have a quick look at 1 Corinthians and familiarise yourself a little bit with that letter. And of course, have a look at the excerpt from John Pritchard's book, Living Faithfully, and Being Political, for next week, which is quite appropriate given the UK election is next week. We'll be right on topic there. Then obviously our own country is having its election later in the year, but
UK, which is
Thursday.
Yeah.
That's right, Thursday. So do that, and then of course spend some time with your journal. So thanks for bearing with me tonight, everybody. I know we've covered a lot of material, but hopefully you've at least dipped your toe into the waters of the 4 Gospels and how each of them are similar but different. So I look forward to being with you all next week. So good evening and goodbye to Dinsdale. Good evening and goodbye to Tokoroa. Good evening and goodbye to Waihi. Good evening and goodbye to New Plymouth. And good evening and goodbye to Morrinsville. And good evening and goodbye to Taumarunui. And then also goodbye to the groups that are looking at this material at other points in the week. Have a great week, everybody. Enjoy night prayer in one another's company, and look forward to being with you all again next Tuesday. Good night from Charlotte Brown House.